All right, everybody, welcome back. Here we are, man. We are at Chattanooga right now. We've been here for Chickamauga 155, and we're sort of previewing Chattanooga 155, which really took place in October, November of 1863. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. I'm Gary Edelman. We got Chris White behind the camera over there. That's Dan Davis, also with the American Battlefield Trust. You'll see both of them before too long. Really happy to have Dr. Anthony Hodges back. Dr. Hodges works with the Park Partners, a local expert on Chattanooga and Chickamauga, goes way back into these parts, and I'm really happy to be able to introduce now one of my favorite people in the world, A. Wilson Green, also known as Will Green. The American Battlefield Trust actually started in his living room. He's one of our 7 original founders. He's a past president of the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites, which later became the Civil War Trust, the American Battlefield Trust. Ranger at Fredericksburg, the founder or the founding leader of Pamplin Historical Park, a great place in Petersburg, Virginia. And I think I'll shut up now. Written a bunch of books, blah, blah, blah. Thanks for joining us, Will.
Thank you, Gary. And I guess we're not in Petersburg anymore, Dorothy.
We are not indeed.
We're here in Chattanooga. Actually, we're on top of Lookout Mountain at the entrance to Point Park, one of the original units of the Chickamauga-Chattanooga National Military Park, established in the early 1890s. And the very distinctive gate that is behind me here is designed to look like, I'll bet you already know, the Corps of Engineers badge, because the Corps of Engineers and the military were responsible for developing the initial infrastructure at Chickamauga-Chattanooga National Military Park. So this is the place where we talk about the Battle of Lookout Mountain, although the battle does not occur up on top of the mountain, and we'll cover that a little bit later.
Good, good. Well, let's go inside with no further ado. Here we are. When you do this, there's all sorts of stuff inside. We're going to talk about this. We're going to see some nice views as we go in. So let's go on in and see what there is to see. Will, how long have people been coming up here to kind of view this place? Hold on. As a park?
Well, this has been open to the public since 1896. When Point Park was established. A lot of monuments, plaques, artillery exhibits are up here on top of Point Park. I think a lot of people are a little bit confused about the Battle of Lookout Mountain. They come to this highly developed several acres of land, and they, of course, make the logical assumption that the fighting took place here. What we'll see are the positions of a couple of Confederate artillery batteries, and of course there was Confederate infantry up here, but Confederate infantry on top of Lookout Mountain played almost no role in the battle on November 24th, 1863.
Yeah, well, you know, and share this with your friends as we go along. We're going to walk across the park a little bit here. And again, like so many battlefields, we're going to find that we can simply come here and it makes sense all of a sudden why they didn't fight on the top. How you could capture the hill without capturing the top. Dr. Hodges, you've been coming up here for a long time. Got any good Lookout Mountain stories that are appropriate for this group?
Well, I'll leave a few out. I will say this was a popular tourist area even well before the war. The northern point was owned by a family named Whiteside and that lived in Chattanooga. They charged admission, so even in the 1850s, this was a popular tourist area. Just south of Point Park, the Whiteside established a large hotel complex known as Summertown, where people would come up during the summer to escape the heat, although I believe all of us say it's pretty darn hot up here right now. So this was a popular tourist area even before the war, and the soldiers come up here as well too.
And of course, Anthony Leonidas Polk was up here on Lookout Mountain near Point Park in the late 1850s as he was doing his search for a new university, which eventually was established a few miles away from us at Sewanee, Tennessee. So there was an awful lot of pre-Civil War development up here. But this was a recreation site, and to some extent it is here today, but we're going to be spending some time explaining to you all about the fascinating history that occurred here, particularly during the battle.
Well, let's keep talking a little bit as we go, but just, you know, you've heard of Leonidas Polk. We've been talking about him. By the 20th, he is in command of half of the Confederate, army at Chickamauga.
The right wing.
And then, of course, in 1864, at a place I think called Pine Mountain, he's going to have a really tough time.
He has a bad day with a shell there.
Yes, and a really particularly effective direct hit. And there's a small monument to where he breathed his last in 1864, right before the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, as far as I know. You're watching the American Battlefield Trust. I already see some people checking in. We've got some from Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Keep telling us where you're from as you go along, and we'll do our best to bring you all of this stuff. We're not showing you the cool view yet. You're going to have to hang on a little bit longer. Let's walk a little bit over this way and talk about some of the plaques we have here. Chickamauga and Chattanooga are one national military park. So you'll see, for those of you who've been joining us for the last few days, you'll see some plaques here put here by the War Department that help us understand the Battle of Chattanooga. Let's check these out real quick. Here you're looking at the casualties. The Confederates are red, the Union are blue, of course. Gray and blue don't stick out enough, so the Confederate stuff is red in the War Department's mind. What else is up here, gentlemen?
Well, I think a very important feature of this park is the New York Monument. It's hard to see from this angle. You can see the figures on top, but one of the main themes of Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park when it was founded in the 1890s was reconciliation. That is really symbolized by that New York Monument, where up on the top you have a Union and Confederate soldier shaking hands under one flag, the American flag. So that's very symbolic of the reconciliation that the parks help bring about.
And of course, Chickamauga-Chattanooga National Military Park was a perfect location for the first National Military Park, as Anthony says, in terms of burying the hatchet between the sections, because here at this park the Confederates have a victory at Chickamauga and the Federals have a victory at Chattanooga. So each side can take pride in their armies and not have to demonize the other side. So it was almost inevitable that this park would be the first of the national military parks.
And this area was settled by both Union and Confederate veterans after the war. Many of these men, even though they'd fought on opposite sides during the battle, become business partners and friends. And so you have a different climate in Chattanooga than you have in many other places. So there's already this climate of reconciliation within the population, which all combines with the things Will said to make this the perfect area to have one of the first national military park.
And let me just say, just real quick, you could, imagine what it must have been like in the 1880s and 1890s when almost every state legislature and most of Congress is populated almost entirely with Civil War veterans. You wonder why there's national military parks. You wonder why there are monuments erected in these parks and whatnot. You wonder why 1/5 of the Illinois state budget went toward the Illinois Monument at Vicksburg in 1903 or whatever the year was, because, Civil War veterans are basically controlling all the legislatures and all the Congress. Around toward the cannon,
Yes.
Okay, I think we can't escape now. Now we're going to have to show a view shortly, and I think you're going to enjoy it. But for now, it looks like we have a couple of heavy Confederate Parrott cannons. Again, these are Parrotts because you can see the wrought iron reinforcement band around the otherwise cast iron gun. This made it a little bit stronger. This looks like a 20-pounder to me. Yes, it is. It was made in 1862. This gun could have been used in the Chickamauga and Chattanooga, Ringgold, Atlanta campaigns as we went along. Now, maybe I could ask Will if Chris will turn around here to show us a little bit about the great view from here.
Well, we're up here on one of the iconic views that shows up on every Chattanooga tourism brochure. The view from Point Park looking out across the skyline of Chattanooga and the Tennessee River, and lots of other features that we can point out here. Of course, the Tennessee River is key to understanding what happens in the Chattanooga campaign. And it would be a lifeline for the Federal Army eventually here. But prior to the fighting at Lookout Mountain and the fighting at Wauhatchie in October of 1863, the Tennessee River was in control of the Confederate Army. And part of that control was the basis of being up here, occupying the point of Lookout Mountain with Max Vanden Corpet's Cherokee, Georgia artillery, which was located in this position.
Very, very cool. Now, just look at the view. Let me tell you, you knew this would be a tall mountain, but for those of you seeing this for the first time in a way, you are way above Chattanooga, and you can imagine what a commanding height it is. And if Chris can look over, you'll see in the fog to the right, you might be able to catch Missionary Ridge. I'm not sure if I can quite get Chris is focusing in on it even better. So battles for Missionary Ridge are going to be down there. A smaller eminence called Orchard Knob is down that way. We'll be visiting that, we hope, today as well. But we're going to get an even better view as we walk further down. So let's keep walking and talking as we go, okay?
Yeah, staying with the theme of Vanden Corpet's battery, a few years ago I had the opportunity to visit his battery's locations during the Atlanta campaign at Dalton and Resaca with our good friend and partner Steve Davis. I'll also point out that Vanden Corpet is buried in the same cemetery in Atlanta where there's a monument to Andrews Raiders who were hung after their raid and who you will be familiar with from our earlier live at the Chattanooga National Cemetery.
And what's cool is, of course, is that I was there with Will Green last year during the Trust Conference where we went down to Resaca. This American Battlefield Trust Civil War Trust arm actually preserved the location of Vander Corbett's battery at Resaca, if I'm correct.
That's right, and what's remarkable about it, as Dan says, is that the Federals captured some of Vanden Corbett's guns and actually dug out the earthworks and dragged them back out in, I think, what is a unique operation in the capture of enemy artillery.
Really, really cool. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. We're up on Lookout Mountain here. There's all sorts of cool things. Maybe we can get a better look here of the New York Monument as we descend the hill a little bit to actually the most famous part of Lookout Mountain. But here's the New York Monument. Dr. Hodge has already pointed out that you've got a U.S. and a CS, Union and Confederate soldier on top, really stressing the reconciliation that was rampant in the 1890s, early 1900s, among veterans even, okay? Even as they were crafting a story that might fly in opposition to a story a lot of people would tell today. Now, we're kind of coming down here a little bit, okay? We want to maybe get another view here. After Chris does this, maybe, Will, I could ask you if possible, so tell me in a nutshell, or tell our viewers a little bit about what's going on here. So Chickamauga ends. We talked about this a little bit more here. Chickamauga ends, and then eventually you're going to have the Union and Confederate armies coming here. We got as far as talking about Rosecrans being sort of in Chattanooga, and you talked about Lookout Mountain commanding all this, but give us a little bit more. What's happening in the weeks and then maybe month after Chickamauga?
Well, Rosecrans's army, as you said, Gary, survives to fight another day. They retreat into Chattanooga following the last day of fighting at Chickamauga and basically establish a position about 1 mile square within what is now the confines of downtown Chattanooga for the most part. Here they are quasi-besieged by Bragg's army. Bragg decides not to make a frontal attack against this position, but instead occupy the high ground around Chattanooga, except for the north, on the other side of the Tennessee River. So he places part of his army on Missionary Ridge to the east. He extends his forces across the Chattanooga Valley between Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain, and he puts forces up here on Lookout Mountain and in the Lookout Valley to the west of us. This essentially reduces Rosecrans's army to a very impractical supply line. They cannot use the railroad. The bridge over the Tennessee River and Running Water Creeks are destroyed, so the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad is no longer possible as a supply line for the Federals into Chattanooga. Because the Confederates control the left bank of the Tennessee River in Lookout Valley, you can't bring forces across the Lookout Valley to reinforce and supply the Union Army. So this means that Rosecrans's only option is to bring his supplies down from Nashville on the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad to the towns of Stevenson and Bridgeport, Alabama, and then place them on wagons, take them across another mountain very similar to Lookout Mountain called Walden's Ridge on a tortuous route on a very primitive road across Walden's Ridge down into the north side of Chattanooga, then across the pontoon bridges at Chattanooga to supply the army. And eventually the mules and horses who are bringing the supplies across this horrible route eat about 3/4 of the grain that's in the wagons in order to sustain themselves, meaning that the Federal Army goes on half rations, then on quarter rations, and by the time this Chattanooga campaign really begins with the fighting, the Union Army has basically a couple of choices. They can either retreat, they can try to make an attack, or they can starve. And this is where we'll kind of pick up the story with the opening gambit, which is the product of Ulysses S. Grant, and his #1 mission, create a viable supply line.
And let's talk about this while we walk. Dr. Hodges, Rosecrans is often accused of, kind of just sitting here and waiting for the inevitable starvation, but that's not the case,
Personally,
right?
I do not believe that's true.
Good.
He will eventually, Lookout Valley, the direct route from Chattanooga through Lookout Valley to Bridgeport's 25 miles. By the route Will described, it is over 60 miles across a couple of mountains they had to take. Rosecrans actually had a plan in place very similar to what will actually occur, and usually Grant and Baldy Smith are given credit, but Rosecrans, I believe, had actually initiated that plan. So he was not doing nothing but, to the War Department, probably in Washington, and Charles A. Dana and other people who were here literally spying on Rosecrans were reporting he was doing nothing. Personally, I don't think that's fair to Rosecrans, but whether I think it's fair or not, Rosecrans is replaced in late October and U.S. Grant comes in. He simply tells Smith and the engineers to keep the plan you have in place for opening Lookout Valley, but in the end he gets credit.
And Ulysses S. Grant, Anthony, had his list of enemies.
He definitely
And
did.
Rosecrans was on that list. So you can't discount the personalities involved in this campaign. We almost always focus on the poor Army of Tennessee and its dysfunctional command structure. But there were personality issues that dictated events in the Union Army as well.
And again, and it doesn't help that Charles Dana, the Assistant Secretary of War, who is here essentially, as Anthony mentioned, as a spy for the War Department, is sending back some incendiary dispatches you can find in the official records about Rosecrans and his conduct here. It does not play well in the White House and with the War Department with President Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton.
In fact, I just picked up a book while we were at the Chickamauga Visitor Center called General Grant, The Rewriting of History by a gentleman named Varney. Not been able to read the book, but it looked like it was picking up many of these themes that we just talked about how definitely Grant's colored the way we view some history by his memoirs. And when you look at other people's writings at the time, you'll find some discrepancies according to this book.
Well, that's exactly right. I can tell you that's true in the Petersburg campaign as well. But this doesn't make Grant any different than any of the other generals who wrote their memoirs after the war. Very few men are willing to write in their memoirs, you know, I really screwed up. I was really unfair to this guy, and I should be ashamed of myself.
And I think that's great. These are people, okay? From general down to private, these are people, and they're just like us, okay? And they have their differences and difficulties and whatnot. You coming down, Chris? Because we're not going to really stop here. I think we can just walk on toward the extra view, but enjoy this view while it's here. It is one of the more photographed views here at Chattanooga. You want to hand me the camera? Okay, good. Well, then let's keep moving here. Nice view. You've got a Confederate battery. You see people posing right here. 100,000 people are watching them take their picture right now on Facebook Live. So really cool. Please, if you come here yourselves, be careful. Enjoy a moment of zen here. All right, so now we're going to descend a little bit more of the hill to get to the most famous spot as we go along. So Grant has arrived. You could say Grant sort of takes credit for an existing plan at Brown's, on how to supply the Army. We're going to talk about that in more detail when we actually go to where that plan would come to fruition. But Grant doesn't just bring the next plan. More troops are coming, guys, right?
Absolutely.
Who's coming in October and November?
11th and 12th Corps under General Hooker come from the Army of the Potomac. Will, who else comes?
We've got 3 divisions from Grant's old army himself, the Army of the Tennessee, and with William Tecumseh Sherman, no doubt Grant's favorite subordinate, at the head. They're going to be marching over and using the railroad from Memphis, the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, to come in to really take the lead. And we talked about personalities in the past, and one of the personality issues that affects the way this campaign unfolds is Grant's affinity for William Tecumseh Sherman and his desire to see Sherman get the credit for the upcoming victory.
And speaking of credit, I wish you viewers could see Chris White descending these steps, twisted body, #twisted body, as he's coming down here. This is not easy to accomplish. So we're heading down toward what is known as Point Lookout. So as we come down here, Grant's bringing more forces here. He's working to enact sort of Rosecrans and Smith's plan to try to feed the Army. Things are changing now. What about Bragg? Bragg's got his Chickamauga Army. Is that changing at all?
Yes, I mean, we've talked about personalities. The Army of Tennessee is basically its command structure's one constant argument, almost from the moment it's formed. Nothing changes. As the Union Army brings in reinforcements, Bragg actually does just the opposite. He sends Longstreet off to Knoxville to oppose Burnside's. And so Bragg begins the process of winnowing out his enemies as they're encamped on Missionary Ridge. There's a lot of discord in the Confederate Army because of decisions that were made at McLemore's Cove and other places during the Chickamauga campaign. So Bragg follows almost the opposite program. He starts dividing his army, sending men off to other places.
And he also purges his army of people he doesn't like. We mentioned General Polk earlier. General Polk will not be here because Polk will be sent to Atlanta and waiting a reassignment away from the Army of Tennessee because Polk was one of Bragg's enemies. Well, the entire table of organization for the Army of Tennessee is different at Chattanooga than it would be at Chickamauga.
Cool, and let's talk about this real quick. Just real quick, I noticed Illinois, Virginia, Pennsylvania. Tell us where you're from as we're going along. We got Tennessee represented as well, so I'm going to need you guys for this. So this is sort of an improvised order of battle for Chattanooga. It's different than Chickamauga. They were just talking about this a little bit. So you've got U.S. Grant at the head, and his main forces are going to be commanded by 3 people. You've got William Tecumseh Sherman over there. You've got George H. Thomas over here. And you've got Fighting Joe Hooker down here. And then they have some additional like corps under them. For instance, Hooker has the 11th and 12th Corps. You've got Howard and John White Geary and whatnot. So anything to say about this structure? How is this working for the Union during this campaign, Will?
Well, this is, to call this an army group is really more accurate than an army. As Gary said, there are 3 elements of 3 separate armies here. The Army of the Potomac, the Army of the Cumberland, and the Army of the Tennessee. Needless to say, these men have never worked with one another. So, and there's going to be some mixing and matching of the divisions here as well. I'm not sure that plays a huge role. I think it's a credit to the division commanders here that they're able to function reasonably well, even though they're not operating under their old organizational structure.
And Anthony, let's look at this. But looking on paper, it looks like Bragg has a much more efficient sort of situation here on the order of battle. He's got him in charge of basically 3 main forces under Hardee, William J. Hardee,
John C. Breckinridge.
Good.
Cavalry under Joe Wheeler.
Good. So, I mean, he's got a smaller force than he had at Chickamauga, but he's got arguably an efficient force, and he doesn't have to cover and encircle Chattanooga. And here we are. So we're going to head down a little bit further down toward actually Point Lookout, or also known as the Ox House location. We'll talk about that when we get there, and we might have a little quiz while we're down there. So be ready, gentlemen. Let's go. Is it this way? I haven't been here in a little bit, so I guess you can
guiding service at its finest. Which way do we go?
Exactly. So we're walking down here. I mean, and there's a lot of rocks up here that have names. We're going to Point Lookout, but there's the Point Rock. There is Roper's Rock. There's other rocks. Gentlemen, before you go too far, do you have a favorite rock up here on Lookout Mountain? And yell it.
Well, mine is Roper's Rock at the point where all the photographs were taken. I'm a collector of pictures taken down at the point, so that's one of my favorites, called Roper's Rock, because a photographer soldier
Okay, go ahead.
fell off of the rock there from a Pennsylvania unit. I've got a head on one of Gary's stories, it looks like.
All right, you did, but nonetheless, check this out. Usually the joke is a photographer saying back a little further. In this case, it was the photographer that actually fell off the rock, and the rock bears his name. So let's see, Chris, it's hashtag jumping while filming. I've seen a couple of these maneuvers already that Lookout Mountain requires. So let's continue on down. It looks like we are coming up first on a famous photo location that we might want to check out. Let's see, actually. We'll just see where we're walking here. Enjoy your moment of zen. That's when we're not talking, which is a rarity. I like the moment. I stole it from Oh man, check this out. We are walking through the Ox House Museum, so to speak, and let's get out here and Will can tell us what in the world that is and all the cool stuff we're looking at. This is the best view at Chattanooga. Will Green, what do you have to say?
Well, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, I'm going to say about 20 words, because this is really one of the most spectacular views in the whole Civil War landscape. And if Chris is able to pan around, we'll point out some of the features that are visible from where we are now. Needless to say, the Tennessee River is down below us. It's flowing from our right to our left. In this part of the world, the Tennessee River basically flows east to west. It makes a giant turn here, just downstream from Chattanooga, and this is called Moccasin Bend. It got its name because the peninsula that juts out into the river resembles, if you use your imagination, an Indian moccasin. And Anthony probably knows more about the origin of the word Chattanooga, but there's many stories about it, but one of them is rock that comes to a point.
That is the most popular and the most consistent story about the meaning of the word Chattanooga.
And here we are at the rock coming to a point where Lookout Mountain is an 86-mile long ridge. I think sometimes we think about mountains as being peaks, but the mountains around here are all ridges. And this one goes 86 miles into Georgia and Alabama, but its northern terminus is right here, the rock that comes to a point.
It ends about Gadsden, Alabama.
So as we go from west to east, should we do that, Anthony?
Yes.
Let's go west to east. As we look over to our west, to my left here, you can see that in the distance, the mountain range of Sand Mountain, which is the mountain that is immediately opposite the Union head of supply at Bridgeport and Stevenson, Alabama. That will be one of the obstacles that the Union Army would have to cross on its way to the Chickamauga battlefield. As we get closer, the mountain that is just to our west here is called Raccoon Mountain. And it has a gap in it that you can see, but that is the mountain that's immediately to the west of Chattanooga. Now, as we look across the Tennessee River, straight ahead of us to the north, the mountain range that you see disappearing into the mist off to the north and east is Walden's Ridge. That's the mountain over which the Union supply line had to come in order to get into Chattanooga. About halfway down our view here, Chris, where you see some low-rise white buildings in the middle distance and on the right side of the river, that's the approximate location of Brown's Ferry. And that will become a very critical spot in the Chattanooga campaign, which we'll talk about when we get to Brown's Ferry later on today. Then as we go across the peninsula of Moccasin Bend, the high-rise buildings that you see are downtown Chattanooga. That was Chattanooga in 1863. Chattanooga was a small town. It had only been established as an Anglo town, a part of the United States, in 1838. So it was barely a generation removed from Cherokee occupation, Cherokee control. So Chattanooga had a population of somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 people. So as you look at the high-rise buildings in downtown Chattanooga, that was the city. Everything else that you see was farmland or scattered homesteads. Then looking farther to the east, the low ridge that's in the distance, the first ridge that we see is Missionary Ridge. And that will be another position that the Confederates will occupy in their quasi-siege of Chattanooga in the late summer and early fall of 1863. And Chris, if we could walk around the platform here, we might get a view of one of the more critical positions on Missionary Ridge. It's sort of hazy today, which is not unusual for being on Lookout Mountain, but to the far right you'll see a dip in the ridge, and that is the gap. That's called Rossville Gap, and that would be not only the main retreat route for the Union Army from Chickamauga, but it would also be the goal of the Union attack at Lookout Mountain on November 24th. So we want to bear in mind what the importance of that gap.
And that the goal of getting that gap is that Bragg can't escape. If so, is that right?
Well, that's right. You're gonna pin Bragg down. Do you want to get into the major plan of Grant's plan at this point,
I think
Gary?
we probably should. Let's do it, but let's, it's probably worth a good hour. Let's do it in 1 minute or two.
Well, I'll start out, and I'll let Anthony fill in the gaps. Of course, Grant gets assignment in October, about October 19th, to come to Chattanooga to rescue the situation. As Anthony pointed out, his first act is to relieve Rosecrans of command, replace him with George Thomas. He's got the 2 corps from the Army of the Potomac coming his way under Joe Hooker, and he also summons 3 divisions of his old army under Sherman to march over from the Vicksburg area. His first task is going to be to establish a supply line, and we'll talk about that, but it is successful on October 27th. I would say, and maybe Anthony will disagree with me here, but I would say at that point, once the Federals have established a viable supply line leading into Chattanooga and have relieved the possibility of starving the Union Army out, Bragg really has no reason to be here.
I agree. The battle is over once Brown's Ferry falls and the direct route through Lookout Valley is open to the supply line. Essentially, in my mind, it is over at that point. I will note a couple of changes in terrain while we're up here. Lookout Valley is the vital key position, I said, but Bragg only sends 2 regiments over there. 4th Alabama acts as sharpshooters to close a road on the north side of the river, actually firing across the river. The 15th Alabama is pickets along the river's edge, but basically 2 regiments. One of the reasons that he only sends 2 regiments over there is the problem of supply. Today you see the interstate go at the base of Lookout Mountain. That land did not exist in the 1860s. When the interstate, there was just a very narrow railroad track with a very small cart path beside it, another road that goes across the lip of the mountain. Directly behind the hospital on Moccasin Bend, there is a rise. It's hard to tell from this high up. There's still beautifully preserved earthworks behind that hospital. There were Union batteries positioned there, and any time the Confederates tried to bring supplies across the brow of the mountain below us, that battery would open fire on them. And you read some of the Confederate accounts, they come to the clearing, they wait for the shell to hit, enough guys run across till they've had time to reload, and then they go through that whole process again. So that battery on Moccasin Point makes it very difficult for Bragg to have ample forces at one of the most critical points, Lookout Valley.
Hashtag cross the clearing as you go. Could you imagine running that gauntlet as we go? Now, I want to move on to something else, if I may, unless you had something you were itching to say, Will.
Well, let me close the loop on Grant's plan here, as we originally started. He's waiting for Sherman. We mentioned before that Sherman is his boy, and he wants to give Sherman the key assignment in relieving Chattanooga of Confederate presence. And so as Sherman gets into position here, he is going to march across Moccasin Bend and take position on the right bank of the Tennessee River in a hidden location in order to go across the river and attack the northern end of Missionary Ridge. At the same time, Hooker is given the assignment of coming across the nose of Lookout Mountain and going across the Chattanooga Valley toward Rossville Gap to cut off the southern end of Bragg's army at Missionary Ridge. Thomas's army, which is not held in high esteem by General Grant because of its defeat at Chickamauga, is in position to the east of Chattanooga in order to make an assault once Sherman and Hooker have accomplished their goals. They're kind of the cleanup crew, but they're not going to be given the main assignment. So that's the big picture, which you might note does not include a battle of any consequence of Lookout Mountain.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, easier said than done. I've always thought, you know, and we'll get into this more, you know, Grant really prefers his boys, Sherman's boys. So kind of what Hooker and Thomas is doing, I think no matter what they did, he was still going to give the credit to Sherman, it seems, for what's going to go on here. Now, we are at a cool spot. We've looked at a lot of things, but I want to point to that rock right there, if you can, Chris. That's, you know, the real point lookout. Some call it the Point Rock. On the other side, you can call it Roper's Rock or something like that. But this is the spot, and I'll ask Dr. Hodges to come up here and show what you've seen. You know this spot because this is one of the most photographed places of the Civil War. In fact, it is the most photographed outdoor site of the Civil War because there was a photographic gallery up here. A guy named Lynn had a very you know, well-established studio up here. He would put his camera right on that rock there. If you look at that rock close enough, you'll be able to see the 3 divots in the rock where he would place his camera. I don't think we can do that from here today. And Dr. Hodges, you also have some other photos here.
Yes.
Tell us about these a little bit.
This is actually Lynn is a civilian employee making maps. The photographic process was used in that. Shortly after the fighting, he comes to this spot. He realizes the business potential of taking pictures here. He leases this from the Whiteside family that owned it and had been used as a tourist attraction. This is Lynn with one of his stereo view cameras. You can look at this picture, and then if Chris holds it up, you can see the same background with the modern changes in it. Now, one of the first thing Lynn does is he decides to take some photographs, stage a reenactment of the raising of the first flag on Lookout Mountain. The battle was fought in the fog. The people in the city of Chattanooga and the Confederates on Missionary Ridge could not really determine the outcome of the battle because it was fought in the fog. And so members of the 8th Kentucky Infantry would come from down at the Craven's house. They would raise their flag on the point of Lookout on the morning of November 25th, and as the fog burns off, the flag of the 8th Kentucky is seen by the defenders of Chattanooga and the Confederates on Missionary Ridge, and they realize Lookout Mountain has been taken. So as one of the, perhaps one of the first Civil War reenactment, Lynn has the men reenact their scaling of the heights as well as their planting of the flag up on Lookout Mountain on November 25th. So this is one of Lynn's original views of the planting of the flag.
That's the Mount Sarabachi of Chattanooga.
Mount Sarabachi of Chattanooga. All sorts of people over the next few years of the war will come up and have their picture made. Here's General George Thomas and his staff. Taken probably after September 1864 when Thomas is going from Atlanta to Nashville. I also point out, we talked about yesterday at Chickamauga, the gap in the Union line being spotted by, or the alleged gap in the Union line being spotted by Rosecrans' nephew, Lieutenant Kellogg. There's Lieutenant Kellogg, the man who is partially responsible for the gap in the line at Chickamauga.
Hashtag cornflakes. Now, I want to point out one thing, and this is another one of Dr. Hodges' original photos. If you can, Chris, focus on this guy. Notice he's standing on a little piece of rock down below the top. Maybe that'll help a little bit. But if not, just trust me, Chris can focus in on it. There is a lower ledge right below that place over there, right about there where you can stand. And I want, after Chris focuses in on it, because there are 100 or more photos of people standing on that little ledge, if you go down from there, it's not like there's some rock and it's deceptive that you're going to survive if you fall. You are going to die, okay? Chris, if you could zoom up from there and really show, there's no bones about it. Ask Roper about what this is like. If you fall down off of the Point Rock, that is it for you. Now, other photographers came up here, and I want to show this one. First, I have a far away shot, and then I have a close-up. This is at the National Archives, but I just like this view. You can see her dressed really well, and if I'll focus in on here, the close-up here, she's got a nice pouty face when you focus in on it. We don't know who she is. I hope through a new program called Civil War Photo Sleuth that we might be able to identify this. Go to Civil War Photo Sleuth and upload your photos, and the more they have, the more they might be able to identify using facial recognition, okay? Now, as far as I know, you have more photos and everything, but there are hundreds taken up here. I think we want to walk to our last site as we go. Anything to say at this point, gentlemen?
I have nothing.
All right, well, good.
A rarity.
Here we are. We are on the American Battlefield Trust Facebook page. We're at Chattanooga, right after Chickamauga 155 Live. We really appreciate you joining us and coming on these journeys with us, and hope you enjoy this view from Lookout Mountain. All right, so now we're going to walk down from the Ox House Museum Plateau, and we're going to go down to some photo sites that you know of. So give it a sec while we go down these steps.
At Dale and says, we have Confederate.
So what's cool is we're basically walking on Roper Rock right now. And if you want to see Roper's Rock, you see it right here, okay? Now note that there are the world's most rickety ladders. Like, how are you supposed to get from there to there exactly? And then that ladder goes to another rickety ladder and another rickety ladder with just huge gaps in between all the rungs on the ladder, okay?
Government issue.
Yeah, and exactly. I'm told, by the way, that this ladder was later built into a baby crib, and the Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park has this baby crib made of this wood, supposedly. So this is where the photographer fell off. He was a soldier turned photographer, named Roper, Pennsylvanian, and that's where he fell off. So we're walking on it. But we're coming down to this site for a different reason, okay? And that is because there is a different photo taken here. Chris, if I can ask you, to the degree possible, to kind of get up here and then come back and face me. First, I'll show you. No, not that high up. This will be good enough, I think. So here's the photo that is taken from this spot. Now, there's going to be some vegetation in here. What's interesting about this photo, of course, is that you have some members of Grant's staff, and then humbly, below them all, in the lower corner, U.S. Grant. Okay, you often see retouched versions where it looks like he's smoking a cigar. It is my opinion that you're actually looking at a stick going by part of his head at the point. It seems to be going into his nose, not into his mouth. So I don't think it's a cigar, but we do have two photos of Grant holding or smoking a cigar at Massaponax Church. Now, what's cool is that Grant is standing basically at the top of those steel steps. Now let's come down a little ways so that maybe we have some chance of seeing some of the rocks in the background here. So Grant is standing right about here. This is where the ladders from Roper's Rock actually came up. Now there's nice steel steps that you can take up there. Grant is here, and his staff is oriented, throughout. What's interesting here too is that you can see through the trees, or trust me, that's the umbrella rock, which you can see right in front. After Chris pans up, you can see it here right up there, and the umbrella rock is, in fact, right there in the distance. If you look at the angled rock right here, I hope from this location you will be able to see that portion of Roper's Rock right over there. You can see the angle right there. It's exactly the same thing. So if you ever want to stand where U.S. Grant stood, you can go to his cottage up in New York where he would write his memoirs, or you can stand right here at his wartime self, getting close to the zenith of his career. At this point, with so many good things behind him. This is just an incredible documentary photo of the Civil War. Grant actually on a mountain his troops helped to capture. Gentlemen, anything else?
I believe you covered.
Okay, well, let's just close with a last moment of Zen as Chris pans around this beautiful view from Lookout Mountain.
And we're now looking into Lookout Valley on the western edge of Lookout Mountain.